I'm going to just briefly describe what a job guarantee is. This is not, of course, a job guarantee isn't a fixed thing. It's been around for many, many decades. People have been thinking about it. Needless to say, we would be pioneers, as we have been in the past, if a real job guarantee was offered here. But of course, there are very similar versions of it that we're all familiar with. But I thought this summary from one of the long-time proponents, a guy called Bill Mitchell, an economist, was quite a good, succinct one. A job guarantee offers a job at a living or minimum wage to anyone who wants to work but cannot find employment. So it's pretty unconditional, and that's the sort of the basic concept. So looking at it in a little bit more detail, and again, we could design it any way we like, but this is the concept. First of all, it's paid for by central government, and it's so it may be delivered elsewhere, but it's paid for by central government. So they're on the payroll of central government. Direct employment, and the employment's typically delivered through central government, local government, non-profits. So it's not business. It's not grants to business to create jobs in the private field. It's direct employment by the government and direct actual worker management and employment by those government and non-profit entities. It would be set at the minimum wage or potentially the living wage, which is a discussion point that's got both social and economic issues around it. Very importantly, it's voluntary, and for it to be truly voluntary, it needs to sit alongside the unemployment, the dole, which is actually just to say writing unemployment benefit in a slide. So it's a voluntary scheme, and it would not replace the unemployment benefit. But if you take up the scheme, you're not going to be receiving the unemployment benefit as well. Very importantly, it's flexible. It's been referred to as a buffer stock. That means that it rises and falls as the economy rises and falls. So when the demand for jobs is there, private enterprise will create jobs above the level in terms of pay conditions or career prospects or whatever it may be of these job guarantee jobs, and people will simply move out of the job guarantee into the private sector. But then the reverse will happen on the downside of these inevitable business and economic cycles. Now, on that front, it's intended to be transitional. In other words, you actually have to design it so that people, you don't expect people to be there long term. You expect that they're going to be actively looking for work. You expect they might leave any time. You expect they might arrive any time. And there's no career advancement. In other words, when you're on the minimum pay, if you were still working for the job guarantee in 10 years' time, you'd still be on the minimum pay. There is not intended to be career advancement, at least in the money sense. But that's not to say that there aren't opportunities for people to benefit in other ways. Another thing is it's permanent. Now, we're all familiar with the Keynesian idea that in difficult times, the government plows in with large amounts of money and gets people working. And sometimes, as we've seen with the original New Deal and so on, and what was happening in the 30s in New Zealand, the government actually creates work and puts people to work. But this is permanent. This is part of the economic fabric of the country. And so it is not intended to be just there for the bad times. It's there all the time. And very importantly, the jobs are not meant to be in competition with the private sector. So it's not, in fact, the idea is the private sector should be actively hiring out of this pool of job guarantee workers. Now, if we look at the case for the job guarantee, basically there's an economic case and there's a well-being case, and obviously they're also closely connected. So the economic case is, with these automatic stabilizers, of which we're seeing them as people start to, as they start to lose jobs in a recession or a downturn, they go onto unemployment benefit and the government's costs increase. And the government is putting more money into the economy through that mechanism. partly countering the loss of demand that's causing that downturn typically. So they act as it acts as an automatic stabilizer. And in fact, in terms of, the economic or the macroeconomic view of things, it is actually an alternative to the current system of using unemployment to control inflation, which is a nasty turn of events that we got into a few decades ago, and is instead using employment. So instead of the current system where, once the when things start to get really good and people are getting in jobs and there's lots of people employed and, wage demands are starting to sort of build up, then what does the Reserve Bank do? Well, it jumps on it, raises interest rates, kills investment. This is at least the theory, and pushes those workers into unemployment to try to stabilize inflation. Now, this works in exactly the opposite way. In other words, it actually takes people, it puts people into the workforce when they're needed, into the private workforce, and it keeps them out of the private workforce when they're not needed, and it helps to manage inflation by employment rather than unemployment. The other thing is, and we discussed this at our last meeting, but it's a fiscal tool. So in other words, it's about government spending. It's not a monetary tool about private banks and the Reserve Bank and the private bank spending and the private sector through the banks spending. So when new money is introduced into the economy to create more demand where demand is needed, it's coming through the government spending it into the economy rather than the banks lending it into the economy, which, as we know, is in New Zealand is almost universally through the mortgage and land-based asset tool, which has led to a lot of inflation as they put more money in than was needed. So government spending is the tool that drives this. And that fits in with where the world is inevitably going, because, as we all know, the central banks around the world have flooded the world with vast amounts of free money at the taxpayer's expense, and it hasn't really done a lot for the economy, but it's done a lot for inflating asset prices, and now and lowering interest rates, of course. And now we're in a position where the world is having to think about alternatives to that system. It's run its course, and fiscal, as in government and government action, government spending, is really where a lot of economists now are focusing their thinking. Would have been unthinkable even a year or two ago for a lot of them. Okay, so on the well-being front, well, there are benefits as well. Really top of my list is it fixes the market failure, because if the private sector has been unable to employ everybody, that arguably is a market failure. And it's been a particular market failure, as we know, in particular sectors. For example, low skilled, a lot of regional areas where the work is not near the people who need it. Young people, regrettably, often have a harder job getting into the workforce than they should, and so on. So we know the private sector has failed, and it's a legitimate role of government to fix market failures, and this is definitely a big one. I don't think we should underestimate the dignity of having a job. I mean, it has huge implications. You could even go to the work as a right, which a lot of people subscribe to, and I think that's a legitimate area that should be looked at. But the point is, it's important to someone's self-worth, and of course, it's a lot easier to find work when you're employed than when you're not employed. At every level. And again, we all know the health outcomes, child poverty reduction, there's more money goes into families, and families are less dysfunctional and less poverty stricken. It's a great training opportunity potentially, because, a lot of employers, as we know, this is a country of small businesses where employers are very reluctant to train. They'd rather hire in or bring in from overseas ready skilled workers. This is potentially an opportunity, if we used it right, for training. And not to mention and we'll get to this a little bit later on when we start talking about the exact types of jobs and so on, but there's potentially enormous environmental and social benefits from the work program itself. So that's just a few ideas and few things that have come up here that other proponents are looking at. And I'll open up for discussion and just leave this for us to have a look at. But here's our, you know, one of the challenges with looking at economic history, not just in New Zealand, but the rest of the world, is most of the charts start in 1990, which is when the damage was really getting serious. And so it gives people a wrong perspective. But we've had decades and decades of employment under 2%, 1%. But actually the conventional economic wisdom for years has been that 4% is around full employment, and if it starts to get lower, then the economy is going to get overheated and it needs to be jumped on. So, you know, the potential is there, not just the potential, the natural level of unemployment is probably what it was back in those booming post-war years of around 1%. So a job guarantee could deliver that level of employment by fixing the dysfunctional aspects of the private market. So with that in mind, and remembering that don't forget to unmute before you speak, and I guess we can try the hand raising and so on as well. It'll be a bit hard for me to necessarily see everyone, but let's give it a whirl. Let's throw it out there. Just off, you know, that kind of brief idea, or that, if that was the job guarantee, if that was a description of the job guarantee, is there a place, is it a solution looking for a problem? And indeed, what problems, if any, can it solve? Any thoughts? Matt.
Thank you, Martin. Just wrestling with the technology. And thanks so much for the really interesting presentation. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sure.
Fantastic, great. So my question would be, when I look at this and the kind of problems that you raised that it seeks to solve, the typical reaction to those these days, I think, is to spend and invest in infrastructure projects and programs, and engage private companies in those. And that would lead to those companies then going out to employ a lot of people who are unemployed. That's a lot of the purpose of sort of, you know, major shock investments in infrastructure in the wake of major shocks. And this, when I look at this program and proposal here and contrast it with that, my question is, what kind of projects and programs would people be employed in? Because we know in those cases that I mentioned, or that model that I mentioned, it tends to be in infrastructure projects that will benefit the country and society. And then the second thing is, in the process of outsourcing those projects and programs to the private sector, or it might be private-public partnerships, what you're also getting, apart from the profit motive, of course, is the managerial expertise of those companies in implementing those projects. Now, they don't always go fantastically, I know that, but my question would be, where does the managerial...
Just losing you there, Matt.
It's really interesting. Sorry, it's Shirin. Maybe I should can you hear me?
Sure can, thanks. I can.
Yeah. Okay. So look, I'm at Forest and Bird, and one of the things that I noticed as one of the things that we've done at Forest and Bird on Waiheke is I've realized that there are a lot of people who are working at Forest and Bird and doing the weeding and delivering the contracts, but there's no upskilling of anything. There's no learning how to manage a project. And it just feels that it's almost like the job guarantee over a number of years. But what I'd really like to see is not just that we're employing through this kind of scheme, but that also we're you know, developing the skills, and we're using it more as an apprenticeship thing. So I really like the training aspect, and maybe a variation of it is that some of it's delivered by government, but some of it is also delivered by NGOs and community groups who are resourced to support people really positively, or even things like the apprenticeships through Auckland Council, you know, that they're not just about delivering the minimum project level. And then the other thing, oh, there was something else, but I can't remember now. Sorry, I'll let someone else have a go.
I agree with Sharon. I think a big part of this scheme is training. You don't necessarily have to be working. You can have an option of being in training to get the skills that you need.
And sorry, while we're just getting warm, oh, I keep forgetting what I'm saying. It's this whole Zoom structure.
Sharon, you've just muted again.
Oh no, sorry, carry on. I'm just listening.
So we've got three issues. What's the type of work? How do we get the right management expertise to keep this thing efficient, not going sideways? And how we develop people so that they're actually coming out with more skills, not just jobs. A very long time ago, I was a student and I was on student special work. So I was given a guaranteed job in return for income. And that's how I got through my student years. I only had 2 full-time years. And I worked for the council on the tree gang and then on the beaches, actually. But we had other special workers who were unemployed people who were special workers. And the management team struggled with that crowd, keeping them working, keeping them from breaking the tools. I mean, I know these might come across as stereotypes, but it was a very difficult thing to manage. So it's maintaining, and I think they were forced into it, so that's the bad thing, and that's not what we're saying here. It has to be optional, so people are actually committed and they're on board. But getting the right jobs, which actually take you somewhere, as opposed to just sweeping up the rocks on the beach, yeah, that's a challenge.
Can I also say that when I was in England, I got unemployment benefit for 2 summers when I couldn't get work elsewhere. And it was a really productive time. I worked at the London Lighthouse. It was the time when HIV was going through the roof. You know, some of my friends were artists and creatives. Like that, you know, even that sort of opportunity to say what you want to do and build the things that you want to do. We had those options. I mean, at the moment we have a whole bunch of mums who are, you know, have kids over the age of 5 who are going back to work, and then we're suddenly going, well, who's going to run the gala at the primary school? So there's a whole load of reasons to also give people the choice of engaging themselves meaningfully while getting a little bit of income. The other point I would like to make is that, you know, I think it also maybe needs to be set slightly higher than the dole, because there are costs involved with work and, you know, potentially transport, etc., and that needs to be looked at to incentivize it a bit more.
Excellent. I mean, just to run past my phone.
I'll just mute myself again.
I'll try and do that later. Mike, you need to mute.
Martin, could I just jump in for a minute?
Good. Could I ask, does anybody know if countries like Finland have done anything like this?
I do know that in India they have tried a rural jobs guarantee scheme for a number of years in a particular state. And my understanding is that that experiment actually worked very well by allowing a safety net, providing a safety net to the rural unemployed young, and also providing a path to train them to be absorbed into the private sector. I think that might be a good example to look at.
Mike Smith here. If I can, am I on the mic? It looks to me like this is very much like the an expansion of what we used to call a project employment program or temporary employment program back in the late 70s, early 80s, which was stopped by the Labour government at the time in favour of training. But certainly those schemes ran very well. They were able to be managed. I was involved in quite a number of them, and I think that experience is sort of available to us as well if we exhume it from the past.
I'd like to jump in here and say that I think I benefited from something like that, Mike. I came back from overseas and ended up working in was living in a fairly rural area, but there's always schools. And schools always have many things that they don't have time to do, and that are actually really useful training. So yeah, but I think that the project nature of it should be more open-ended. I ended up getting sort of like turfed off it, and the principal was most upset. But they were the rules.
I just wanted to add one other point to the discussion. You know, I like the idea conceptually. I think it is a fiscal-driven tool for one, and also the stabilizing effect it could potentially have through a business cycle. But there's one question I don't understand. You know, the focus seems to be more on unskilled or semi-skilled labor pool. But you know, when the business cycles go down, there are also redundancies which come up in the higher skilled level technical people. Now, I wonder if in a government guaranteed job program, the government would have opportunities to employ these people and have an incentive for them to come into the program if they are not at the minimum wage level, but a higher skill level.
Can I jump in? I think the other thing that we could do more of is just the social procurement, and maybe building up more of an NGO.
Hey, Sharon, you've gone quiet again. Yeah.
I don't know, it seemed to jump or something. I was just saying social procurement, and we should be thinking about, you know, having more NGOs deliver some of the government sector contracts and therefore have the ability to train things up. I think there's huge opportunity in that space, rather than just you know, expecting businesses to take the government contracts and then commit to the training incentives in the same way. Just a thought.
Kia ora everyone, Adrian again. Look, I was an employment officer during the time that Mike's described. And I guess one of those things that we were looking at was creating things, making people job ready was the whole plan. In reality, what we were doing was supporting some infrastructural stuff that was going on, because the railways plus local authorities, local governments were using that as well. And actually a significant number of marae around the country were taken care of. I think the only thing we exported in terms of job employment was the Group Employment Liaison Service, which was adopted by Scandinavian countries. But we actually grew a whole wave of people that from no skills to semi-skills under the guise of making them job ready. And many of those people lead in community and community development across the country at the moment.
Can we move on, because we're actually also going to be returning in more detail to the questions that we've been discussing, you know, in terms of the types of jobs, training opportunities, and so on. But if we just move on to part two. So part one was really just a quick overview of what a job guarantee of this nature is and what its benefits might be at both the economic or macroeconomic level and also at the well-being level. the inevitable question then comes of can we afford it? And so let's just briefly, what I wanted to do here is not answer the question of whether we can afford it, but I have done some and unabashedly back of the envelope calculations, and the economists in this room and elsewhere no doubt will do a much better job. But I thought it's worth, as we progress our discussion, let's get a bit of a sense of what would be involved in terms of numbers of people, in terms of dollars, in terms of its impact on the economy, and then that will also help us perhaps as we fine tune the discussion of how this thing might work and whether it might work. So again, I've just given that Robert Skidelsky quote there, which I thought was a nice way to at least provide a little bit of justification for one aspect of the benefits of this. Just some big numbers to throw out just for those who just like a bit of sort of numerical context. And these are obviously very approximate, but they kind of give us a bit of context. So our GDP is around $300 billion a year, and the government spends about $90 billion. Directly, and then there's also another 20 odd through government-owned, Crown-owned businesses and so on. We generated a surplus last year of 7.5 billion. That is to say, the government took out of the economy 7.5 billion more than it put in. 2.6 million unemployed. We're the total number of employed in the working age group. Now, at 77%, New Zealand's right up there. It's almost, the highest penetration of employment, way up there in global terms. So we're certainly a heavily employed country. Actually, I think that number's now about 115, but 110,000 unemployed, as in jobs receiving the benefit and so on. I just put a scenario there. If our unemployment reached what it did in the, going back 30 years, well, that peak 1991, 10.7%, that would move to about 280,000. And interestingly, I noticed I think it was the Westpac economist one yesterday was throwing out a number along those lines. He was saying that this recession will be 10% unemployment. Now that said, I treat the economist numbers with a pinch of salt, my suspicion is it'll be significantly more than that. But nevertheless, that's the worst it's been in 30 years, and that would translate to another 170,000 people on the dole under the current system. The stats household labour force survey shows there's about 300,000 people underutilized in some way, of which a big chunk of them are people wanting more work. And I also would just like to draw our attention to the fact that New Zealand government is one of the lowest employers in the OECD, well, actually in the world, in terms of its share of employment, at least in advanced economies. So we're not a big direct employer at the moment. Our government is not a big direct employer at the moment. The OECD average is 21%, and needless to say, those economies aren't collapsing under the weight of all those people on the government payroll. So that's not to say we need to be putting another 10% of our workers on the government payroll, but just to point out that we're not, we're already a relatively low employer of our own people as a government. Okay, so moving on. Oops, sorry. This mouse is a bit temperamental. So if we would, you may not be able to read this very well. Sorry about all the numbers, but look, I'm going to summarize it. And as I say, this is definitely back of the envelope stuff. But
are you wanting to screen share, Martin?
I
100,000.
can't see anything.
Yes.
So interrupt, Martin. I'm just wondering if you're meaning to screen share. We can see video of you at the moment. Are you meaning to screen share?
Oh, sorry. Yes, I am.
Yeah, that'd be great.
What happened is
that we're happy looking at you, but
shut up your background. Where are you?
Yeah. Well, you can get rid of me now. Okay. I'm going to
beautiful ocean background.
Hello.
Yep. Can you see discuss?
Got it now. Thank you.
And I'm going to go back. Yeah, okay. Thanks for pointing that out because, yeah, so my system shut down and I had to go and redo it. Oh, look, I know those numbers would have been spinning in your head, but just so that you can actually just take a quick look at what I was just talking about, those are the basic numbers in terms, just some overall numbers for the economy, just to keep in mind, and employment. Okay, so can you see that back of the envelope calculation?
Yes.
Okay. Right. I don't know if it's, hopefully it's good enough to read the detail, but I've worked an example based on 100,000 job guarantee workers, right? Which on a minimum wage, and again, that's another discussion point for later, would have a cost of around $4 billion a year, 1.3% of GDP. So we can give some context to that, but that's now. The net cost is lower, and there's a couple of items that I've put in there, which is you're not going to be paying them the dole and the work; they get one or the other. So I've assumed that I've just used a figure of 60%. I've assumed about 60% of those currently unemployed on the benefit would move to the job guarantee, leaving about 1%, 1.5% of the unemployment on the dole. And of course, not forgetting that, those job guarantee workers have to pay tax and they spend money and pay GST like everybody else. So as in this work example, roughly $1.5 billion, about 0.5% of GDP, if that was, say, operating now, is potentially what that scheme would cost, at least in terms of payroll. There'll be other costs, which we'll talk about later. Now, there's some other gains from that. Economists will point out, well, particularly when it's convenient, that there are multipliers. I've used the 0.82, which is what the Reserve Bank put forward in a research report recently on the multiplier of direct public spending, which, by the way, was right up there. One of the most efficient multipliers of GDP was direct public spending. So effectively, that increase, that's more money going into the economy, that's circulating around, generating tax and rates and GST and all the other stuff, and business and jobs and so on. And then obviously I've got no idea how to quantify health, well-being, child poverty outcomes and so on. And also, if you're injecting more new money into the economy through direct public spending, you need to inject less through the current channel, which is the mortgage market and the private debt market, which is the current way we get new money into the economy. And I've just put a figure out there of maybe $10 billion less debt that we have to take on, because it's not such an efficient way to generate economic activity. But again, that's just hypothetical. But the main reason I wanted to kind of do that was just to give some context and some, at least an example of what this might look like financially, so we could compare it to alternatives. I know, for example, $1.5 billion is around about what you could generate by having adding a new marginal tax rate over 150 grand. Of 50%. So, 50% over 150 grand would generate roughly $1.5 billion of income. There's other ways to fund things, but just to give a bit of context there. So, I'll leave that up. I'll leave that up in a moment, but thoughts? Can we afford it? Does it stack up? Excuse my back of the envelope, and those with more knowledge of these things can probably give a much better idea.
Can I ask a question? So, can you hear me?
Yep.
It's Helen.
Helen.
Sorry, I'm not sure I'm using the right prompts here, but I've just unmuted myself. I guess I've been sitting here and I'm worried about when you're looking at how you can afford it, the actual ramifications that are unintended consequences of this. Like what I'm concerned about is we've got this sort of vast army of people on minimum wage when we're trying to build an economy which is on wages. So this isn't even the living wage, this is the minimum wage. And you've got these people where I don't know where they're going. Like, I appreciate Sharon saying they could go to forest and bird, but aren't they likely to go into manufacturing and into multinationals, etc., and actually just produce an economy which is like, basically there's this group of people on minimum wage, whereas we were just trying to get them out of that.
Yeah, specifically the job guarantee prevents that happening. These people can't be put into a private operation of any sort on the government payroll at the minimum wage. They have to actually be hired out of the job guarantee scheme by the companies, who need to presumably provide them with a better incentive to move. It's also, and I've used the minimum wage in my example, but one of the things we'll discuss later on is, should it be minimum or living if this thing happens? But Helen, that is definitely a good point, and that's one of the kind of design parameters that we should look at pretty seriously, is how you stop that happening that you've just described.
Thanks. Is there anywhere where this has actually been done? I mean, I know that we were talking about in India, but I think that's the universal basic wage, isn't it?
Rajiv, that was...
I think...
tried a universal basic wage.
Sorry?
Sorry, on the Indian example, this was actually a rural employment guarantee scheme, not the UBI.
Okay.
So
yeah.
this is a different one.
So, no, so in answer to the question, Helen, it hasn't directly been applied. The closest we probably came to it was that post-war period where Keynes' fiscal stimulus to create full employment, that was its specific goal, was operated in a number of countries, including New Zealand, and it absolutely worked. Now, this is not quite the same, and you know, but it actually, that would be the closest in terms of a massive rollout, I guess, that you would. And actually, a lot of the things we were discussing, where people sort of had experiences back in the pre-neoliberal days, you know, as university students and what have you, would have been the sort of the last gasp of that public-spirited full employment is what matters. A job for everyone is what matters, and the government will make sure it happens. Now, Matt, you put your hand up pretty quickly, and so did Eugene. Did you have a comment?
Thanks. Yeah. I would just have a question about these figures, because when I divide 4 billion by 100,000, I get 40,000. So
Yep.
I'm assuming that's the income, let's call it salary, for each worker. And I would sort of link back to the previous question and say, well, if we're paying them for $40,000, what are they doing? And if it's something like working on infrastructure or cleaning a beach or building a road or something like that, then there are all of the material and operational and administrative costs that would go around those programs. So I think there would need to be some inclusion of the cost of running the program, and also the expenses around whatever activities they're doing, facilities, transport, all of those sorts of things. I think just including the wages or the income of the person may not tell the full picture.
Yeah, very good point. And there's about typically maybe 20 to 25%. I think at a later slide, I've sort of put in a figure of around about 20%, because you're right. The management costs, the materials costs, the overheads are an additional cost, and they could be higher than that. But you're absolutely right. This was just done on the basis of salary. So,
okay.
Eugene.
Thanks, Martin. My comments are that there have been some traditional job-rich sectors of the economy that we probably need to focus in on, and one of them has always been housing, and we all know there's an acute shortage of housing. And traditionally, the army was also used as a great training ground. People would learn to be electricians and plumbers and all sorts of things in the army. I think Grant Robinson this morning in the news was saying he's at short and medium and long-term programs. So I would like to suggest that we look at things that are going to generate wealth, like a lot more power stations, once you have a whole heap of power stations, then businesses will tap into the energy they create.
Thank you, Eugene. Any other comments before we move on? That's.
Can you hear me, Martin?
Oh yeah, hi, Steve.
Yeah, I can't seem to find the put your hand up button at the moment. So, but I just wanted to go back to PEP and TEP, a bit of history there. That often it was local governments that were given money to employ people, and I was employed on that basis. I do recall that we were all employed at award wages, and we were all in the union, which then was the local government officers union. So it wasn't a cheap scheme. It was, everybody was, treated as if they were actual, proper workers. So I'm not saying that this scheme should be part of that. All I see this scheme doing is, in a way, just kind of automating the directions that the Labour Department has been operating under since about the turn of the century or before, which is to provide jobs for people or to provide training for people and to require people to be available for work and available for training. But so that's just my view. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Steve. And again, that's a very key point. That the system that I described has been designed in a way that goes out of its way to avoid these job guarantee jobs, disincentivizing people from moving to the private sector. In other words, if and this is part of the discussion we'll have as we look at the design, how we might design this, is you could go hard on in a way, things like the level of pay and conditions and so on that this sets is the new low with which the private sector will have to compete, right, to get people off out of it. Obviously, there's other things like career advancement, even at the same money, or a cut and pay.
Oh.
Okay, someone needs to take over as chair until Martin comes back. Who's going to volunteer to be chair?
You can be chair.
Turn your audio on.
Well, just to note that unless he has the paid version of Zoom, it has a time limit of 40 minutes as well. So we may run into that shortly.
Well, shall I just say what I was going to say while we wait for him? Well, I will. Can you hear me? So I think one of the things is to also keep an eye on the bigger picture, because I think some of this stuff seems to be about keeping people busy. And I really take on board Helen's point around creating that kind of minimum wage economy and being careful that it does keep up with training apprenticeships and all these things that over time were there and have been eroded. And the other thing is that, people who work for government are basically delivering for the country. So why are we suddenly saying here we're just looking at minimum wage type roles? Because essentially there are lots of different roles that can be fulfilled by government that aren't just about, breaking rocks and putting them on roads. And the other thing I think is around cost saving and where the costs lie. At the moment, I'm quite interested in how all these private equity firms are going into the 16 to 19 fees free market. And I don't know if you're aware of that, but all these things like NZMA, NZTA, I think it's NZTA, all these private tertiary training providers, behind them are private equity firms. So like that's another way that government money is going into the private sector, and then through fees free, we're paying for it as taxpayers. So maybe even thinking about the way money is used within the system and whether that could be reorganized a bit better. The other thing is that we don't know, this COVID-19 thing could actually mean that the government needs to be a much bigger employer on many different levels, because potentially lots of small businesses are going to go under, or lots of companies like Air New Zealand can't over the long term sustain that level of employment if they're not actually running flights and things. So again, how does the government actually play a much more active role in supporting business, small business, and other things? Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, can I ask a question? I'm sorry if it's already been covered. I have had to jump out a couple of times just for work calls, but I'm just wondering, how is this hugely different to like Te Heke Mai and Mahi Mana, which are schemes that where the government pays the employer the equivalent of the job seeker support plus extras, and then that's paid to the client back through making sure that their wage is higher, because obviously job seeker support is $5.69 per hour. And so then the employer's responsibility is to meet them up to the average entry level salary, while also being required to do tertiary level training with them as part of that agreement.
Yep. So, I'm just hitting the wrong buttons there. It differs on a number of levels. One is the it's a direct employment by the government, and actually it has both an economic reason and a well-being reason. So there's two sides to it. It's not the system you've described is actually the government paying money to private employers in order to employ people, whereas this system is based on an unconditional job. In other words, you don't have to please an employer, you don't have to go through a job interview, you don't have to be selected from hundreds or whatever, prove your worth. You get a job automatically, and it's deliberately a government job, so that it and is designed so that people can come into it and go out of it on as the if private employers need them. I wouldn't see it, by the way, replacing the kind of thing you're talking about, Brittany, because I would think those kinds of initiatives could still happen. And I mean, hey, we can design the system any way we want. It could be, for example, that private employers could, subject to safeguards to avoid the problem Helen was describing, that some people could be placed with private employers, because that would have fantastic career enhancement opportunities, for example, if that was possible. So yeah, it's different in that it's the government directly employing as opposed to subsidizing private employers.
Okay, I understand that. Te Heke Mai and Mahi Mana, they're also non-discriminatory, so it's not like what you described where people have to go through interviews and stuff. That is managed through MSD work and income, so all clients are eligible for those. Anybody who is unemployed or seeking to upskill or train or whatnot. I just think having private employers is useful because there's such versatile industries that the government doesn't have
is it
control over.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
Sorry?
I'm not that familiar with the scheme you're talking about. Is it run by a non-profit?
No, they're run by the government. Te Heke Mai and Mana and Mahi, they're both government-run programs.
Yeah, I mean, certainly however the scheme is designed, it has to encourage people to move out of the job guarantee into the private sector. So it's got to have really strong links to the private sector, and it might be that there is some way to incentivize a few people out of the job guarantee into the private sector if that was needed.
Yeah, so that's what this does, because it provides training through. So the employer, so for instance, if MSD was to partner with, say, Downers, for instance, then they pay the Te Heke Mai and the Mana and Mahi to Downer, so that person is still supported and funded by the government through those two schemes. And then Downers, for instance, is responsible for upskilling them to an apprenticeship, through an apprenticeship. So they pay that. And then they guarantee that placement job in practice. And then at the end, Te Heke Mai and Mana and Mahi is paid to that client. And then they leave that fully qualified and able to be taken on by that business in a private way.
Yeah, I would see them running in parallel, actually, because what you've described actually is a fantastic way to get people into some really skilled roles, which wouldn't be the work they would be doing, typically in this scheme.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other comments?
Martin. So I like your economic picture, right?
Yep.
I don't know about the math on the back of the envelope because I'm not an economist, so I've got no idea, but it sort of seems logical. But the devil's in the detail, and I think we had some good points before. I can't remember who it was. I think, you know, is it a good idea and can we afford it? I think we should completely park that and say, what is it? So what will we actually do? And because this is the challenge, are we going to really not compete? Are we going to just create jobs that are permanent jobs instead of a bigger state sector? Are we going to find something which adds value to the people and the economy, but the idea is fantastic, and the idea of using fiscalness for video, if I'm going unstable now, the idea of using fiscal rather than monetary stimulus is fantastic. But what is it we're actually talking about? I think you need to go to the details for this conversation to really make sense.
We do.
That's for me anyway.
That's kind of where we're kind of heading now. So, in fact, perfect. Thank you, moderator number 2, because we'll move the discussion along and look at some of the design issues that are that we need to look at. And we've been talking them through. How would it work? Now, I've just put this, sorry about the list, on a screen, but again, it covers some of the issues that we've already been touching on, because these are indeed the things we need to be thinking very hard about. Now, I've presumed, because actually that's the way these things tend to be run, because they're designed with an economic goal in mind as well as an employment goal, but you know, shouldn't compete with the private sector, which does lead, of course, to the make work criticism, because, you know, that's one of the criticisms of this scheme, is that the work is worthless and it's just, you know, digging holes and filling them in again, which it doesn't have to be. But nevertheless, you know, you create a straitjacket for yourself by insisting that you don't want to compete with the private sector. You want to actually make it easy for people to move to the private sector. So that's, obviously, all these things are debatable assumptions, but that's sort of one of the ones that tends to be core to the people kind of putting this forward. Available to full and part-time people, so you know it allows flexible employment. You know, around whether it's around child minding and so on or whatever. Minimum wage, but as we see, living wage is another very common one. And of course, whatever you do, you raise the floor for the private sector, and that can be a double-edged sword. It can slow down moving into the from the job guarantee of the private sector, but on the other hand, it's one way of ramping up the private sector terms and conditions. Now, I'm just, you know, this is speculative, but I mean, turning WIN's job search officers into job creation officers, you know, in all the regions and all the towns and so on, maybe some instantly available infrastructure, but obviously you may need staff retraining and other issues. The jobs need to be delivered locally where they're needed, because obviously one of the great failures is the private sector has not delivered jobs, for example, in small towns and so on. So again, delivering it through local government and NGOs, for example, is a way to ensure that the on the ground is localized. I look at the kind of the jobs specification a bit like franchise businesses. You know, the key to a franchise business is you need to make a job that's you know, easily described, easily trained, repeatable, so that you can quickly move people, whatever their skills, you can quickly move them into that role and replace them when they move on. You know, McDonald's breaks up a complex business into lots of small, repeatable, doable pieces. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily the whole way of doing it, but conceptually, because this system is designed to be the ultimate flexible, you know, job system, you can't guarantee that the employee that you took on last week is going to be there next month because they might have hopefully found a job, you need, and of course you don't know when the next employee is going to be walking in the door, you need that level of flexibility. And that's a huge management challenge, something that Matt and Paul raised earlier on. And I think that's one of the really key things. I think if it's a permanent scheme, you've got the opportunity to build institutional knowledge and capability, which you don't have with project-based schemes that are, for example, just rushed in when there's a urgent need to, find jobs for a rush of unemployed and then is switched off again. And the PEP, to some extent, suffered from that because it wasn't baked into the economy the way the fiscal responsibility rules have been baked into the economy. And by the way, this is an alternative to the Reserve Bank and the Fiscal and the Public Finance Act operation. Because it hasn't been baked into the economy, it's very easy for it to be kind of switched on and switched off at political whim. But that management is really, really important, and it, as also Paul pointed out, it has a need for some extra money going in. So 20-25% is what's sort of often put in. And I know when I was running a business, we add 20% to payroll for our general overheads costs as a sort of a standard budgeting tool, and it wasn't too far from there for the scale of business we had. Training opportunities. Now, really, as I think everyone's pointed out, these need to be, it needs to be an incentive to be trained and to be finding jobs, and we need to make it easy for these employees to find jobs and train. Now, you think of yourself in a private job. If you walked into a private job, you're having to sort of scurry around and pretend that, take sick days for job interviews and pretend that, and no one's going to help you retrain to get the skills to move to that other type of job. So I see this as being job assistance and training being a primary part of it. Personally, that would just be my view. And again, a lot of it's widely cited as a benefit. Voluntary is really important. So it is a work commitment. If you sign up to do your 40 hours and you don't perform in a reasonable way, then it should be possible to terminate that employment. And of course, if you can terminate that employment, they have to go somewhere, and that's where, as a minimum, the dole needs to be around so that people who have to be fired basically have got somewhere to go, maybe for a period of a month or 3 months or whatever period stand down period you put in place. But also there's other reasons why people may need to be on a job seeker benefit, such as they're only planning to be, they're actively looking for a job from day one and they don't want to be doing this. So it's not forced on anyone. And another design question would be when, the moment you're unemployed, can you walk in and get one of these jobs, or do you have to go on job seeker for a period of time, whatever. So those are just some things to consider, and I'm sure there'll be more because I'm not a policy design person. But that's kind of thoughts, discussion, ideas on the practical nature of it. And again, we're going to move, by the way, to what types of jobs in the next phase of the discussion. So this is really just trying to think about maybe some of the more operational things. Matt.
Oh, sorry, thanks, Martin. I was just withdrawing my hand because it may come later and I might be jumping ahead a bit, but I'm thinking now about the sort of political tactics of this.
Yep.
And the timing. Obviously now everything will be consumed by the corona restrictions and the impact that has on the economy and what should be done going forward in the immediate and medium term to deal with that and the unemployment and other problems that it will raise. So a question I'm not necessarily looking for an answer right now should this be seen as part of the measures for addressing that, or is it something that's a sort of a longer term program? Because obviously the focus will be on what are the immediate measures that government needs to take to try to deal with the fallout of the virus.
Does anyone have a comment on Matt's point? My view is it's perfect timing in the sense that we will need a short-term urgent solution, which raises the possibility that that's one of the political hurdles that's then overcome, and that may provide the opportunity to bake something into the, effectively into the public finance framework, the way we manage our economy, which is what the Reserve Bank and Public Finance Act have been doing between them for 30 years. And so I would see it in that respect as a potential stepping stone, because it's moved from one-off project to permanence.
So you're seeing it as part of the COVID response. Okay.
I think that's potentially the case. Eugene,
could
you
I
have your hand up. Oh, sorry. Someone else.
Robert speaking. In Stuff this morning, there's a comment or a report on what the Minister of Finance, I've just lost the, it's called Coronavirus, Government Starts Economic Planning for Post-Lockdown New Zealand. And Grant Robinson is really starting now to talk about how to gear up the economy to deal with the economic threat that the coronavirus is talking about. And I think that's most probably worth having a look at, because he's talked about asking Shane Jones and twice to start looking at infrastructure. He's talking about the medium to long term. How do we come out of this strong? How do we come out of it moving as quickly as we possibly can? It says that he doesn't want to commit to himself about reassessing the relationship to the wider world, but he's asking the question about global supply chains and particular tourist markets. And he's also saying that there are already groups burrowing away within the private sector looking at both clean energy initiatives and the housing market, saying the government be looking at the kind of industry development model, what do we do so that we don't repeat previous mistakes? So I think at the moment there is a good window of opportunity of really plugging into how we want to see the economy to come out of this and to work how to come out of it. So I think that the comments, this discussion really needs to be tailored to try and work into the thinking that's going on at that level, because I think it'd be much more, if one wanted to bring about change, this is the time to do it.
Thanks, Robert. Chris, you just raised your hand. Chris? Okay. Rajiv, you had your hand up.
Yeah, no, I think Matt's point is a very interesting one. It would seem to be expedient to put this scheme into place now under the COVID situation. But, I'm a little concerned about the political economy challenges which we might face, because I think looking at the benefits of this and the nature of this project, it would seem to me that we need to place it away from ideological extremes, because sometimes resistance develops simply because people might perceive this to be a government-run thing and government's role in the economy and so on. So, and I think some investment may need to be made to build broader support for this, which may need time. And as a follow-on of that also is a question of, Helen's point earlier was we don't want to have a large pool of people in this permanently. And I think that's another interesting point. And maybe we need to build partnership for this with the private sector. Allow for apprenticeship training and a transition of the workforce away from this pool into the private sector, which again would need some investment in terms of time to build that support.
Yep. Okay. Phil. Oh, no, sorry, not Phil. Eugene, you're underneath Phil on my screen.
Thank you. I've questioned the idea of having the government running this. There's some real problems with that. Firstly, if you set up some scheme that is government paid, it's very hard to unwind it. It may be totally inefficient. It may not actually do anything that's really useful, but you then face the prospect of cancelling it, where do the people then go? So that's one issue. The second issue about government is that government itself is usually quite inefficient at wealth creation. There've been some colossal errors on the west coast of New Zealand that Labor got involved in many moon ago. So I really don't see that it has to be government. It could be some government. It doesn't really matter who are running the jobs, as long as the work is being done that is socially useful and or is something that's generating wealth. There's some contradictions between your material. In one part, you're suggesting that it be permanent, but then you're also saying that people can move in and out. It's very disruptive if you're trying to run a business. If you've just finished training someone and then they get poached to go and work for a private enterprise, so then you haven't got the skill to actually do the job that you're trying to do. So then you have to go and retrain someone. I think that this it's okay, the design is fine, but it needs to have more. That these should be permanent jobs that go somewhere, that the people actually could stay in these schemes or these projects permanently for the rest of their lives. They're actually worthwhile, real jobs that are doing something really good, rather than sort of seeing them as simple things which you really go nowhere. What happens if you're in one of these schemes and you've been trained to do X, Y, Z, simple task? Where do you go? It's very demotivating if you don't have a future path. So I think really it's all good, and I totally agree that it's better to give people a job than pay them the dole. But I think if it was a 16-year-old turning up at your door who doesn't have really a lot of skills and is expecting to get a job at 40 grand, that's fine, but do you let them start the job? I mean, surely the first thing when you're getting someone is to assess their skills and put them into training so that they're capable of doing not just simple tasks, but real jobs. That's a few ideas.
Okay, thanks Eugene. Paul, you've had your hand up. I'll get you to just, I'm just about to launch a poll on one of these questions. So I'll hand the floor over to you, Paul, so I can do an admin thing.
Okay, if my voice is shaky, tell me I'll turn my video off. At the moment, we are about to be in a position where the government's paying a very high percentage of our people to survive, right? So this is a nice theoretical discussion, but the government has just paid 2-point-something billion to employers to keep people fed. I listened to the Prime Minister yesterday saying that even if your business is dead in the water, please just pass the subsidy on so that people have something and you stay attached to your your employees so that they're around for the next for the post-crisis. So we've gone from one extreme to the other overnight, lost in 2 weeks. So everything we're talking about here should really tack on the back of this recovery from the virus, which is going to take a long time. It's not sort of 4 weeks. And so the government is today paying thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, and it's going to be more next week and more the week after, because I'm around business and cash flows are looking frightening. Everyone's just very, very anxious. So that's, so again, it's a nice theoretical discussion, but we are doing it now, right? It's just happened. This is not theoretical. We just paid 2-point-something billion to everyone. Now how do we roll out of this into something different than the past? And people are saying this, the roads are empty, the skies are empty, the air's clear. We're all got used to work from home. We now don't have to go and visit each other to have meetings. We can do this thing. Everyone's saying what's the thing new, and most people believe it's not the same as the past. And so to me, this is just one new part of the new.
Yes.
I think that's the context. Sorry, I'll shut up now.
Okay, Sharon, you had your hand up. Thanks, Paul.
Yes,
by the way,
well,
I've got a poll up, as you've probably seen.
Jo has said that she's wanting to speak and has put her hand up a couple of times, so I'm just flagging that now.
Oh,
but,
okay. Jo,
look,
appearing on my screen, sorry.
I think just to follow on what Paul is saying, it's that this thing of like paying employers to keep people employed. I mean, if we had a universal basic income, that would already be operating. So I think it's really, I mean, obviously everything the government's doing is magic in terms of, you know, adapting to this situation really, really quickly. But there's an opportunity to adapt again and just work and just create that kind of levelish playing field where everybody has something moving forward and can build on that. And, you know, while this, I mean, I think we can see it in the comments, which I'm not sure if everyone's reading, but there seems to be a lot of interest in that universal basic income and the fact that this job guarantee still fails to take into account a whole bunch of things that were possible under the dole and that are no longer possible. So things like all that artistic creation, looking after sick family members, looking after parents, looking after children, and just creating a job that you want. And especially as we transition into another economy and we're, you know, well, we're thinking of a low carbon economy, where is the opportunity to think about what those solutions are as New Zealanders for New Zealand, instead of being driven by other people's agendas? And if we're moving to a localized economy, which I think is the way that we are going to have to live into the future, what does that mean? We want as much creativity and the time to be creative and link with each other locally as we can possibly get. So just a thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Jo, did you want to contribute?
Well, the discussion's moved on for what I wanted to talk about, so I feel like I've just been landed in it by Sharon, to be honest.
Oh, okay, that's okay. Oh, sorry, you hadn't appeared on my screen, so I didn't see the hand wave thing. But anyway, we'll...
Yeah, she kind of just sprung it on me. I wanted to speak about 20 minutes ago, so I don't think it's very fair that she brought it up on camera, to be honest. I think it was rude.
Okay, look, no problem. Geraldine, I see your hand's up.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment about, there's been a lot of talk about, you know, people needing training on these schemes and how do we get them, you know, shouldn't they be doing meaningful work and getting training, and if we invest in training and then people disappear and so on. Look, I'll tell you, you know, my situation, the reason that this appeals to me is that, okay, at the moment I work for a university. Great. I mean, because of the funding model for universities, they actually don't have any reason to lay us off. You know, their funding is secured for the rest of this year. But should I be in a position... Now, I have a master's degree. I have 30 years of experience in a variety of different industries. But if I was laid off, okay, now I'm perfectly capable of finding other work. But it will take time. And in the intervening period, it could be 2 or 3 months, it could be 5 or 6 months. In that intervening period, I want to be in a position where, A, I can do something useful in such a way that I'm also free to go and attend job interviews, go and meet with people to discuss possibilities, sort out CVs, you know, this kind of thing. But at the same time, do something that's useful in my local area. I mean, there's a walkway next to me that needs cleaning up. There's, you know, rubbish and recycling that's never done properly. There's, I have a master's degree, but I would be really happy to do that kind of thing. And incorporate so that I still remain part of life, part of society, and then move out of that. Now, I'm not looking for advancement through that process. I'm not looking to get more money from there. I'm looking for a way to keep myself socially engaged and supported socially, but also financially in a way that gives me choices. If this coronavirus thing, there could be tens of thousands of us in that situation, and in that scenario, a jobs guarantee is perfect. I mean, it's better than being on the dole, which doesn't have any social interaction. It's, as I say, I wouldn't need training for it. So I think that there's going to be a huge demand for something like this. They may, and when we talk about meaningful work, it's not necessarily sophisticated work, but it's meaningful, and in terms of it having public value. So, yeah.
Thanks, Geraldine. I think that point about meaningful work that has public value is the almost kind of sums up, I guess, what the concept would be for the types of jobs that they have. That while they may be poo-pooed by, in the business community as not delivering the kind of thing that you would normally be able to buy and sell in commercial markets, if the jobs can be designed to provide public goods, public value, public worth, that's perhaps a legitimate thing. Adrian, I see you had your hand up. We'll move on shortly, by the way, but Adrian, did you still have a comment?
Good. Thank you, Martin. Can I just remind everyone, after you've spoken, just put your hand down.
Okay.
Thank you, Martin. I'm really appreciating the slides. I'm going to kind of do what I kind of often do, just a kind of a reminder that there are 600,000 Māori and about another 300,000 of our Pacific brothers and sisters with a kind of with a median age of only 24 versus 34 for all New Zealanders. So it's going to, whatever we come up will be profoundly affecting this group. I'm also, aware that, and I love the data that you put up before around showing the incredible rise in industry. And I'm reminded that 1964 was really the year that Māori really arrived in the cities. If you were born before then, you were probably raised in rural areas, which kind of coincides with our Pacific cousins arriving. But we all arrived to feed an insatiable appetite for industry. There's a kind of a last on, first off issue that's never gone away. And so when you're semi-skilled, you either don't get in or you're last off when it comes to permanent jobs and that. The other thing around all of this and all the stuff that's been happening since even the fourth Labour government, as much as they've let us down, I consider, is this growing of a new brown middle class in Māoridom and the Pacific arena, which is quite profound and has a profound influence in all the outcomes that we discuss and whatever government's kind of put in. So I guess it's just a reminder about where that kind of fits. And one last thing. So 4.2 billion is what Vote Health was for the 3 DHBs in Auckland alone. And the 12.2 billion is less than Vote Health. And I wanted to acknowledge what Paul said, because the reason we are doing it is because we can pay for it. And because we are one of the lucky nations, fortunate nations that are able to do the kind of things that we are doing. And so I'm just adding those bits to the whole conversation. And I'm really liking where you're going, Martin. So cheers, everybody.
Thank you, Adrian. Now, I'm just going to close off the poll that we've just been running, and so we have the results now. Question: okay, can you see the results? Can you see the results?
No.
No.
Okay, well, you will be able to in just a moment.
Now we can.
Yep. Well, I suppose that answers one of the questions that we've kind of been touching around the edges of for some time, which is nobody wants to make it too easy for the private employers to hire people out of the job guarantee. And also, of course, people want to fairly recognise that they're doing real work that deserves real pay. And, that's screamingly clear that if we did progress this as a group, we would be dropping the minimum and putting living wage into whatever I would suggest anyway, based on that. So thanks for that. Just to give us a bit of a mood of the room. Okay. Now, what we might do. Hello there, Helen.
I don't know how to do I've tried to put my thing on the reactions. Is that how I'm supposed to do my hand up?
Oh, well, anyway, the hand up, that one worked perfectly. Caught my eye.
Right, great. Sorry, I just wanted to talk about the issue that I'm having with this at the current time when we've got all these small businesses sinking and maybe some of the potentials. I'm not saying I'm listening. I'm not at all canning this. But what I'm concerned about is, like, we already have lots of us and lots of our members are small businesses at really precarious points right now, and what the money is actually doing that's going at the moment is it's propping up those small businesses and keeping them afloat. And while I don't want money subsidising big multinationals, I do want to actually, I see an opportunity here to actually start to develop a much more progressive economy, a higher wage economy, by propping up those small businesses. So, like, there are problems, for example, with the precarious nature of a lot of work in them, and we've covered that in the scheme by covering contractors. But what we actually need to do is get those people into being secure in those positions, and those subsidies that we're giving, if they go the way I think they're going to go, they will be more secure in those places, and those businesses will survive when they were actually going to go under. So we're kind of supporting an economy that's already underway. And what I'm concerned about is that this is actually going in an entirely different direction. And I mean, yes, we all answer the question about the living wage because because there's a blank checkbook here, because we're in a conversation where we can take the luxury of going, of course we want it to be the living wage. What I want to see is the living wage and employment agreements rather than contractor arrangements in all our small businesses. And I can see that we've now got the power of the checkbook to make that happen. If we're going to have businesses survive this, they're going to have to do it on the terms of the government, which is more secure work. And, you know, we can use that money to kind of prop them up. So I don't see it as a problem working with the private sector. I mean, I think that would be mad to ignore that and create a whole lot of jobs beyond it, when the private sector that we're talking about in New Zealand is our mates who are running. Like, we've got a guy in our LEC, Peter, who, you know, he and his partners started the spa in Ponsonby. All their people are going to lose their jobs at this point, except for that scheme. But for the scheme, they signed up to the living wage. They have employed their people. Why the hell wouldn't we want to, like, pour our resourcing into that at the present time and getting that right? And would we really want to, like, you know, isn't that at the moment where our focus should be?
Yeah, at the moment, absolutely, Helen. I think it'd be fair to say I wouldn't expect this particular a program like this is not going to be implemented overnight. It's really probably in the next 2, 3, 4 years. You know, if we get another term of government, we would have a crack at it. And if one of the things that have come out of this catastrophe is that people have actually understood the government is the solution, not the problem, as opposed to, you know, the government is the problem, not the solution, then that provides a greater willingness to entertain ideas that wouldn't have been entertained in the past. I think on actually another point you made about the precariat, you know, one of the interesting things about this scheme is the precariat would actually finally have a bit of negotiating leverage, because, you know, if you can't do a better deal than the job guarantee, then don't drive an Uber, and Uber will have to either cut their commission so they can pay their drivers more, or they'll have fewer cars on the road, and so on it goes, you know. So I guess...
So Martin, if you're talking about if they do this, they can't do anything else, because what I would see them doing is doing this plus driving the Uber, and the Uber suddenly can be driven at a quarter the price it used to be, because it's just additional, it tops up. How would you deal with that?
You couldn't stop people now having a full-time and a part-time job. I think you need to leave a little bit of agency there for people. Some people want to just work, you know, 24/7 just to make as much as they can to get ahead.
But my problem with that is it's going to undermine, and we're going to end up with non-minimum, not even minimum wage jobs. We're going to end up with a greater precariat rather than a a better one. We're going to subsidise all those operations which have been working on the fringes.
Yeah, well, I think that's definitely something would need to be taken account of in the design of any job guarantee. Absolutely, because it's an opportunity to fix that problem, but you know, unintended consequences could have the opposite effect. So yeah.
Sorry, I'll shut up now. I promise.
Okay. Well, look, let's just move on because we've got 15 minutes, and I appreciate everyone's patience to have lasted this long. So we've done the minimum and living wage, and at this point we're saying, if we're going to do this thing, let's make it a living wage. I think I'll skip this poll just in the interest of time, but it was just really to, you know, see whether people should be able to jump onto this thing immediately or have a stand down period. And now, we've talked about that. Which jobs? So we've already covered this in a fair bit of detail, but you know, again, I'm citing sort of examples of, you know, where the thinking has been done by others. And Geraldine, I think it was Geraldine, was it? Or Chris made the point, Geraldine made the point about public purpose. So if we think of the jobs as being jobs that serve a public purpose, but do not compete with the private sector, and again, these are all things that we can design them in or design them out. But jobs with a public purpose, which may not meet the criteria of commercially viable, but do have genuine public value, and making our public spaces better, making our environment better, providing greater care and support to our care workers or whatever. Indeed, a point Paul made earlier on about how these, I put major public works with a question mark, because potentially we could have these jobs employed in major public works that would obviously, they're typically done by private enterprises. So we'd have to sort of figure out how that was done in a way that didn't allow private enterprises to get cheap labor and make more profit, as opposed to having some public benefit. But you know, that's quite legitimate to be looking at directing some of this resource to major public works. Anyway, and community activities, and the whole voluntary sector, which has hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, as we know, as often volunteering in many different areas. You know, so maybe some of that could be done on paid time. So environment, care, other, creative, cultural. Sharon, I know you mentioned this one. Potentially it could be used as a startup incubator. I know even now the unemployment benefit, if you, you know, you can get sort of you can get a 10 grand grant or something on the unemployment benefit to help you start a business. And we could set rules around this to make it possible for, you know, young people fired up. I'm saying young, it could be at any age, but to Adrian's point, there's a lot of young people that are in this position, but who see an opportunity and could use it as a kind of an incubator for a startup, and to get a bit of a team together and get something happening in their local area or whatever. So now we've talked a great deal about some specific jobs. I'm going to, let's just try a, here's my challenge, and I imagine you've probably been doing it anyway, is if you've got some job ideas, fire them into the chat. By the way, I'm going to download it and I'll share the chat so we can, we'll have a record of all this. But feel free in the remaining moments, if you haven't already been doing it in the course of our discussion, to fire out some ideas for what might be the kinds of jobs that we feel should be in this program or could be in this program, which will give us a bit of a starting point. Can we find enough of them? I mean, who knows? So I'm going to have a poll to close, but would anyone like to sort of make some general comments from here on? And before we go, please hang in long enough to answer the poll of should we pursue this idea, or should we just sort of move on to the next one? Both legitimate options. I think we're all getting close to lunchtime. Let's, I'm going to put the poll out there now. The final verdict. I'm just launching it and I'll share it in a moment. And now, can you see the poll?
No.
No.
Okay, I have got a technical problem. Now, attendees are now viewing the questions. So why is that not happening?
You can just tell us the answer.
Well, I'll tell you what. Hey, has everybody figured out how to put their hands up?
No.
Yes.
You know, using the technical measure, because we can sure as hell use that. I see Eugene, you've got your hand up anyway to talk, but if you could put it down, and I'm going to get you to put your hands up, because to vote for, should New Zealand have a job guarantee?
Helen, I sent you a chat on how to put your hand up.
You want to have a look?
Okay, now there's a no option. Should New Zealand have a job guarantee? No.
How do we know that those who voted in the last one haven't taken their hand down?
Yep, but I did see Paul's as the only one that popped up after the question. So I'm guessing Maria just raised her hand after having voted earlier. Phil raised his hand. Was that to vote no, or was that to ask a question?
There's icons here, Martin, for yes or no in the chat window. So perhaps we could use those. People who are for it,
excellent.
Select the green tick for yes, and those who are not could use the red cross for no.
Yeah, so I don't know what happened with the poll, that I'm the only one who can see it.
Okay, everyone. Have we frozen, Martin?
No, I think we're all looking at the chat window to see who's voting yes and who's voting no.
Sorry, what are we voting on?
The question is, should New Zealand have a job guarantee? Kurt says the only one so far who's abstained. For valid reasons, Kurt. Okay, well, we keep firing the answers, but it's looking like at this point there's at least interest in pursuing this further. In fact, very much so. How do we keep the links, Sharon? I'll send a file of the chat if that's what you're asking. And I'll also send a link to the slides that I was using, and feel free to comment on them, use them, ignore them, whatever. But I'll send that around the Region 1 mailing list. Okay, well, look, do we have any, if there's no closing remarks and it's lunchtime just about, shall I declare this meeting closed? Thanks a million, folks.
Thank you.
Martin,
Great
could I just
Someone
make one
calling
final
out.
comment?
Oh, hi, Robert.
I mean, I think that the government is now looking at an economy post coronavirus, and I think that there is a good opportunity there to make submissions and suggestions. And my suggestion would be is to draft something up for the government to consider that incorporates some form of job guarantee, because they're predicting major unemployment. So, but it needs to be tailored into that that opportunity. So there's a bit of work doing and in formulating it as to here is a helpful suggestion to deal with post economic planning.
Thanks, Robert. That's it would indeed be fantastic. I hope among the group here we've got a few people who would be willing to kind of leap in and help us. Maybe some. I can set up a shared Google Doc to get us going. To because there is quite a bit of work involved in these things, and obviously we can kind of reconvene on it because it can and should, because this was really just to introduce the idea and see whether it's one that warrants any time and investment. But I think absolutely, maybe I'll send a note around for anyone who would be interested in contributing. We could draft through a little bit more of the detail of the concept and reconvene.
Well, I think the comment you made earlier about waiting for the election and trying to see what Labor could do, I just government and the politicians are concentrated on dealing with the virus, and if we so that's the frame we need to think about.
Yeah, and I agree. We don't want to wait until 3 years' time. We need to start now with the putting the policy in front of people, but its implementation will take a while. Yeah. That's certainly, I think, my thinking.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, feel free if any other final remarks, or feel free to kind of the meeting as you're ready. I'll just keep it going until midday. But
can you hear me, Martin?
Steve, I can hear you. Steve? Was that Steve I'm heard? Can't hear you now. Okay. Well,
can you hear me, Steve? Yeah. Which I know you'd be. Just a question.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
I can now.
Okay, thanks. Just a question about the Reserve Bank's decision to purchase bonds, government bonds on the private market. And then there are other questions as well, but I wouldn't mind at some point if you or anybody else in this group could explain, they call it quantitative easing, but exactly what does that mean, and who is going to benefit and who is going to pay?
Yep. I'm happy to. So what they're doing is I think it's a $20 or $30 billion program.
Yeah.
What will happen is the Reserve Bank will create that new money, and it will use it to purchase bonds, government bonds, not government bonds directly from the government, but from what they call the secondary market, which is essentially like the banks and the institutions and so on who bought the bonds. It will be used to buy those bonds back. Now, just to show how these things work, of course, the Reserve Bank could buy the bonds directly from the government, bypassing the private markets, and that would actually provide $30 billion of money for the government to spend in the of New Zealand dollars. Funnily enough, that's what the first Labor government was smart enough to know that was possible, because one of the very first act was privatizing the Reserve. Making the Reserve Bank wholly owned by the public, It was private before, and the second, one of the early ones, was to get it to fund the housing state housing building program through that kind of process. So quantitative easing is really putting money into the bank system, and the banks then, the financial system, and then it gets into the real economy through the financial system, through banks lending, through institutions investing in shares or whatever, and then having to take another step to the private businesses that are doing it. But it could legitimately be purchased directly, which is actually more efficient. And if you were in, for example, the MMT camp or the sovereign money or those sort of ideas, that's absolutely part of what needs to be thought about seriously. It's $30 billion.
So just a supplementary question then. Having pushed all this money into the private sector, what control has the government got over the destination of that money, or the investment of that money, or the non-investment of that money?
Very little. No, nothing directly. I mean, one of the reasons it hasn't worked since 2008, since it was started, is that it tends to get locked in the financial system. And so it pushes up we've seen it push up asset prices, but not do a lot to stimulate the economy. Now, in fairness, the Reserve Bank has other goals with this bond purchase in the secondary market. They're trying to sort of make sure that there is actually a market for government bonds so that the interest rates don't, shoot through the roof or whatever. So there may be some technical reasons they're doing it, but fundamentally that money tends to get trapped in the financial market, and it's not very efficient. And there's some very strong arguments that we need to rethink how that's done.
So in theory, the money could fly out from the banks overseas, right?
And into, assets, like we've seen a lot of it go into property and financial assets. So there's been an asset boom without a corresponding boom in the real economy in terms of jobs and growth that matters. And you're quite right. In this world, global mobile capital world that we're in, a lot of it disappears offshore. And another thing that the Reserve Bank of New Zealand got recently was I think it was 20 or 30 billion dollar, 30 billion New Zealand, 20 billion US dollar facility to effectively issue US dollars, which is actually quite advantageous to us. But it's indicative of how this global market kind of operates. And the Reserve Bank of New Zealand didn't do quantitative easing in 2008, but we've still had the asset boom because of the fact that this money is global, and it was printed in Europe and the US through the Federal Reserve and the European central bank and so on, and the Bank of England, but it's found its way here, and it's pumped up our asset prices without doing a lot for the economy. So I think we need to watch it very carefully, Steve. To make sure that if there's a short-term technical reason, like keeping the interest rates from shooting through the roof, then that's fair enough. But if it's being used to prop up asset prices, financial asset prices, I think we've got to say, it didn't work in 2008. It's killing us now, and we should get that money in the real economy directly.
Thank you, Martin.
The Reserve Bank's got an extremely healthy balance sheet, as has the Crown, as has the New Zealand government. I haven't got it here, but believe me, the ANZ Bank has a much more highly, a bigger balance sheet by a factor of 5 than the Reserve Bank. So there's a lot of upside, a lot of potential for us to shift private debt to public and have more control over it. I think that's going to happen in the mortgage market when house prices start to collapse, instead of because actually that's quite likely if there's a really serious downturn. And the normal thing is for the banks to start to call in those loans, and homeowners who don't have jobs to be kicked out of their homes. Now, and of course, it becomes a vicious downward cycle. So there's going to be my argument is we should be setting up a state advances corporation again. Because actually the Mortgage Corporation of New Zealand was also supercharged by the first Labor government with that Reserve Bank money initially, but we can shift those what banks call bad loans onto the public balance sheet very easily, keep people in their homes and until they're paying again. And there's a lot of reasons we should be thinking about that pretty seriously too.
Hey, if I could just interrupt for a second, all of your answers accurate on the quantitative easing. Although at this time, everyone's turned to cash because we need cash to keep paying wages. And overnight rates have gone a little high from time to time. So some of the impact of the easing is to just put more money in circulation so that overnight rates can come back down and we can actually just have a sensible, normal system. So I agree with your systematic comments, totally correct. And it's been the wrong thing the way we've managed the whole economy. But at this time, a little bit of easing isn't a bad thing when the overnight rates started to spike.
Yes, yeah, and I agree with that one. And we just need to keep an eye on it to make sure it doesn't become the punch bowl
habit
that it's been. Yeah.
Can I point out one error in the presentation? I don't think that you should allow private enterprise to cry competition, which they no doubt will, left, right and centre, and thereby strangle your proposal. There's nothing wrong with some competition, as long as it's fair competition. The other thing is, in some sectors of the economy, there's no real purpose in having private people invest in it. For example, the health system. We don't want private people investing in it. There's no reason why a lot of the people you're talking about having jobs couldn't be in partly in that sector. Also, there's a whole lot of long-term investments that private groups just won't do. That it's just not sensible investment for them. So the government can do lots of infrastructure projects, of which there is absolutely colossal untold amounts that are required to make New Zealand a great place. Thanks for your show, Martin.
Yeah, thanks, Eugene. And actually, one of the figures I put in the in that snapshot of the some numbers, some of the numbers, was the 13%, which is the share of employment of the New Zealand government, very low by international standards. I personally would be very happy to see a lot of job guarantee jobs be transferred to the permanent public payroll, doing very valuable things, like running daycare, community-funded daycare and early learning instead of $20,000 a year private school fee type rates, and so on, and providing additional care, so whatever, environmental cleanup, or just, but certainly things that seem like they ought to be going on and on and on could be moved to a more permanent structure within the public sector. And we hope one day that this incredible shrinking machine of small government is reversed again, so that a bit of sanity can prevail.
Martin, one last comment from me. Sometimes when the idea looks piloted, so I was wondering if we can pilot this idea in some sector particularly vulnerable or potentially very productive, such as infrastructure, and then learn the lessons before we roll it out nationally.
Yes. Yes, I think absolutely. It may be that infrastructure is where a lot of the initial impetus is. Funnily enough, that Reserve Bank paper I quoted that gave the multiplier for direct public spending as 0.82, it was the highest sort of area, showed a much smaller impact on infrastructure spending. And I don't know, they didn't have an explanation, but their analysis showed that infrastructure spending had a much smaller multiplier. It could be time-based issues or whatever, I don't know, but that was an interesting finding. But direct public spending of the sort that we're talking about here has a very solid multiplier there. But yeah, getting that infrastructure rebuilt after 30, 40 years of neglect, well, a generation or two generations of neglect, I guess, is going to be absolutely key. So Well, we can keep chatting. I've got a paid account, so we can chat for 24 hours before you get cut off. Feel free.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you.
Kia ora, Martin. Adrian again, just on wider issues. Look, it's my privilege to be involved globally in public health. And so one of those things that I'm very much aware of is the struggle that we are facing. You know, is a good one. You know, in many ways, I'm often describing to people that New Zealand is the stinkest house on the flashiest street in the world. And, you know, our economy is so small, but we actually do what we do very, very well. And I just want to come back to that other things that I'm kind of alluding to, is that, you know, the real pressure will be, as the real pressure has always been, particularly since the 60s, on those in our communities that, you know, just struggling anyway. And I mean, people are moving out of that place. But that's kind of rare. What will be kind of the measurement of a lot of the things that we're describing. I'm really enjoying the session, and I'm looking forward to this.
Thanks, Adrian. Laurie, you had your hand up. Is that to talk or was that to vote? You need to unmute your microphone, Laurie. Yep.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
No. Can you?
Yes,
Do you hear me?
I think we can all hear.
You do hear me. Okay.
Yep.
All right. So I would just like to make a contribution in terms of how we think about the future of work in the 21st century technological age and the post-COVID-19 situation, because it is turning a crisis into an opportunity for that transition away from the carbon fossil fuel based economy to the sustainable and non-polluting economy. And more important is the goal to achieve or to serve, that the economy is here to, the economic system is here to serve the social and environmental well-being of the people and the natural world. So as you know, in some of the papers that I've sent to you, and I'll just give you the briefest list of what a community services wage would entail, because as I see it, it's not just about a universal basic income, which just goes to everyone and anyone, no matter what, who they are, I mean, no matter what they do or not do to contribute, but actually recognizing those who wish to really contribute and are contributing. So it really means broadening the definition of what is regarded as real work, because at the moment we're talking in terms of a guaranteed job or guaranteed income, minimum or livable wage, based only on commercially defined work that's profitable and contributes to a growth economy. But if this is going to be transformed in a way that's genuinely socially and environmentally healthy for well-being, then we need to raise up a lot of jobs that are unrecognized or unpaid. Now, a lot of what I'm saying is based on the work of Rianne Eisler and Dr. Marilyn Waring, because we're looking at work that's traditionally been called caring work or women's work or whoever's doing it. It's just unpaid, voluntary, invisible economy work. So what I'm suggesting is that we start to make visible and properly recognize and value the many kinds of work or contribution. And here's just 5 of them for you. So we're talking about this community services wage and working for the common good of humanity and the planet for community well-being. And here's the list. Environmental restoration, for example, waterways, beaches, tree planting, forest care. 2, the assistance of new migrants and refugees. 3, prevention of crime and violence with individual support for at-risk youth. 4, peace education in every school and global citizenship programs. 5, humanitarian aid for people suffering from war or environmental disasters. 6, home helpers for struggling families and teacher aides in every classroom, etc. And then I would even say 7. So it has to include cultural workers, musicians, artists, poets. And in fact, it's not just their work, it's recognizing that our main work is to become real human beings and, full human beings, in that sense of developing our compassion, our patience, our love for humanity and the planet. So it takes a lot of skilled people to facilitate this in a community. And you could just say in terms of mental health or community services, so much needs to be done to help those who are at risk of becoming alcoholics or drug addicts or violent, and and so we need to look at all these areas of work and properly raise them up as real work. I would love to present this properly, but that's just a beginning for today. So thank you very much for this opportunity to speak.
Thanks, Laurie. And actually, a lot of the jobs you cited there in the care area and so on are absolutely the kind of jobs that this program would be aimed at turning from unpaid into paid work, and actually putting people in where they're not at the moment, in a lot of those care roles and environmental care and human care and school, educational teacher aides and that sort of thing. So I think very key point is that this is a scheme that allows you to do those non-commercial but high public good things. Any comments? Thanks, Phil, for pointing out the screen share overstaying its welcome. Okay. Well, I'll declare the meeting closed. I'm going to turn off the screen recording. Which I'll also just circulate. I'll put it on the Economic Policy Group web sharing, and if anyone wants to plow through it or provide it for someone who didn't manage to make our session, then it'll be available, as will the comments that I'll keep.